I want everybody to think if they, everybody might not have known Brother John Weinar. Maybe most of us have. Brother John Weinar, most sweetest man in the world, came to this house right here that we're in many years ago and gave us a talk about resurrection. And this is what he said when he began. I'm going to say the same thing to you. He said, at the end of this talk, I'm going to tell you when the resurrection begins. And he did at the end, okay? And I'm going to tell you the same thing he told us. So right from the beginning of human history, the retrieval of the dead from the grave has been a promise of our Creator. Some of it in the Old Testament is implied, and some of it is explicit. Implied means things like this, like when the Lord tells the first couple that serpent will be bested by the seed of the woman, who will crush the serpent's head. The serpent will bruise the seed's heel, but the seed will crush the head of the serpent. Or there's your first inclination toward that idea. And other places in the New Testament, which I'm going to quote, obviously, is implied and also explained. So it's implicit and explicit. And once we get to the New Testament, pretty clear, because it's about 36 mentions of the word resurrection. It's a hard subject for people because they see life and they see death, but having people come back from the dead is a difficult concept. Even though it's one of the cardinal features and the most important teachings of the Holy Bible, if you went to Christian groups of gatherings and worship services and preachers preaching and theological seminaries and listen to what everybody says, you would never know that. It's because it's better to just not mention that because it's so confusing. It's like what happens if you have, I was thinking of this kind of a stupid simile maybe, but in this room, this next room over here, there's a rug that's very ornate. It's an Oriental rug. I don't know if you're even allowed to say that anymore. So, it's a lot of colors on there. And if you had a stain on that rug, you would never really know it because it's pretty confusing visually. There's lots of things going on. And I think that's what happens with people that are Christians and they are forced to think about the resurrection. It's going to be Easter pretty soon. Every minister will be talking about the resurrection at Easter. That's what they talk, or at a funeral, right? So when there is an Easter service and they talk about the resurrection, everybody can relate to that because Jesus was resurrected from the dead in some kind of a sign of his authenticity and the power that was bestowed on him. That's not hard to understand, but if you go to funerals and you watch, and the ministers always feel obligated to say something at the funeral, like they just have to say something. But if you look at the people that are listening to the minister at the funeral, a big question mark over their heads if they mention the resurrection, right? So let's just examine some of the mentions of the resurrection in the Old Testament, and then some in the New Testament. And I also want to talk very briefly about how we think that works. I don't know if anybody has thought about this recently, maybe not. How many people do we think are in the grave? Think about that for a second. One time in the past, Brother Russell, writing about this subject, calculated, of course, this was the end of the 19th century, okay, so this is what his calculation was. He said he thought that there might have been about 20 billion who had died of the human race. This was a while back. And he did this calculation, maybe you remember having seen this. He thought if every one of those people was brought back they could all stand in the state of Texas, and they would have like a 3 foot by 3 foot square, like 10 square feet each. Okay. And in the US, Texas is so big, it's almost the second biggest state, but on the globe, it's just a speck. So, of course, there's about 8 billion people almost alive now. So we could be at 30 billion, but that doesn't matter. The idea is the Lord has promised that the dead are going to come out of the grave, and he said it as plainly as it can be said. And the confusion on the rug with the stain on it is because Satan has been so successful in convincing everybody that they don't really die, that it doesn't make any sense to consider being resurrected from the dead. For what? Right? It doesn't make any sense. Let's think about the Old Testament for a couple of minutes. Forgot to mark my time, brother. People who are into the history of literature will say that the book of Job is very likely the oldest written thing in possession of the world of mankind. They might be right. Job mentions the resurrection. If we read Job in chapter 19, verse 26, this is what we find. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God. This is the earliest thing we think that was ever written that we have still. Now, Job is probably not right. He thinks he's going to see God in his flesh. But the idea is he's claiming that even though he's going to be have his skin destroyed after he's dead, that he'll be back in the flesh again. This is Job. In Daniel 12:1, we remember, most of us, at that time, Michael, the prince, the great prince who stands for his people. The second verse of that chapter, Daniel chapter 12, says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. All right, what could that mean? Many of those who sleep, and the Bible refers to death as a sleep more often than not. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground shall awake. Isaiah 26:19, thy dead men shall live. Right? How plain is that? Awake and sing, ye that dwell in the dust. That's Isaiah 26:19. How about this? Ezekiel 37, verse 13. This is like an in-your-face type of quote here. And ye shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves. How plain is that? Psalm 49:14. But God will redeem my soul from the power of the grave. A couple more, and then I'll move ahead here. This is one where David is making this same claim, but there's a prophecy involved too. Psalm 16, verse 8 and 9. My flesh shall also rest in hope, for thou wilt not leave my soul in hell. And then the last part of this is a prophecy. Neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. In other words, he's referring to Jesus after his ignominious execution, whose body was not left to rot. He will not see corruption. His flesh will not see corruption. That's what that means. Last Old Testament quote, Psalm 71, verse 20. Thou which hast showed me great and sore troubles shall quicken me again and shall bring me up again from the depths of the earth. So even after 4,000-year history of expectation through the comments made by the patriarchs and the prophets of Israel, this is where we wind up. I'm going to read this from Acts 17, verse 18, and then Acts 17, verse 32. And here we go. He preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection, Now, here's the verse 32. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. See, so, things haven't changed that much. But then we also want to include this 1 Corinthians 15, verses 13 through 18. If there be no resurrection of the dead, we would say to these folks, then is our preaching in vain, and your faith is also in vain. Then is Christ not raised, and ye are in your sins, then they also which are fallen asleep in Christ are perished. All right, so this is the situation that you're still facing today. When Jesus, during his ministry, raised 3 people from the dead, as we find recorded, one of them was in Luke 7, verse 11, it's the widow of Nain's son. Remember, there was like a funeral that was going by, and there was a woman that lost her only son, and Jesus brought that young man back to life. And then another one was Jairus' daughter. It was, I think Jairus was like a member of the synagogue or something. And the young girl died. They sought his help. He went to the house. He said to them, the maid sleepeth, or something like that. I should have looked it up. I didn't. But and they said, no, she's dead. He's not asleep. So he went in and he brought her back to life. And then, of course, Lazarus, which was determined to be more of a public thing, because Lazarus died, and they had a couple of days to travel to after they learned that Lazarus died. Lazarus was a friend of Lazarus' family was friends with Jesus, and they had to travel, so it took them a couple of days. So everybody knew what was happening, and it was like I don't think they had a newspaper article, but that news spread. Okay, and I just want to quickly touch on this about the story about Lazarus, because they said Lazarus is dead. This is John, 11th chapter of John, beginning at 14. And he said, I'm glad for your sakes that I wasn't there, because we're going to go there now, and I'm going to show you something. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. He gets there, and Martha says to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it to thee. And he tells her this. He says, thy brother shall rise again. And she says this, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And then he says this to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Now, if you think that you never die to start with, this makes no sense when you hear this said. But he's telling her that somebody can believe in me and be dead, but they'll be back. And after that, if they live and believe in me, then they don't have to die after that. And here's a story that I like, which is about the Sadducees, who don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And they hear about this master, this young master, this teacher. So they're going to go and they're going to challenge him with this idea of the resurrection, because they don't understand how he's getting away with all this publicity, right? So they go and they tell him the story, which we all are familiar with. It's about the Jewish law, which requires that if a man dies and leaves a widow, if that man has a brother, it's the brother's obligation to marry the widow and, support her and so forth. So they come up with this story, and they go and they say, well, this guy gets married and he dies, and he has 6 brothers. So the next brother comes and marries the woman, but that brother dies. And so they go on with this story until all 7 brothers are dead. And then they say to him, therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? For they were all married to her. Of course, they think they're pretty smart, these guys, right? They're going to go and challenge the teacher with this conundrum that he's not going to be able to solve. And I love the dry language of the King James Bible, because we read that after they posed that question to him, it says, Jesus answered and said unto them, I'm going to read this from the King James, but then I'm going to paraphrase it in modern English vernacular, okay? Ye do err, not knowing the scriptures, nor the power of God. So let's pretend this was happening today. Don't forget, Jesus was not so kind to everyone, except for if people thought they were religious leaders or teachers. He didn't like those people that much. So here comes all these smart guys with this question. They're going to trap him, right? And they're saying, so they all got married now. So whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? And when we read ye do err, I'm pretending that Jesus is speaking to them today. And he might say something like, you guys are idiots. You have no idea what you're talking about. And then he explains it. He says, in the resurrection, he gives, this is two parts to this thing, to this resurrection. In the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. And who are those people? Those are the people that are part of the first resurrection, right? Then he continues, he says, but as touching the resurrection of the dead, have ye not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, and this is important, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And this was, I read this was from Mark, the 12th chapter, but if you go to Luke, the 20th chapter, there's a continuation of that phrase. For he is not a God of the dead, but of the living, for all live unto him. So there's a thing which I was contemplating when I was thinking about this, which was that how that your loved ones live in your memory. Like if you have people that were dear to you and you've lost them, when you think about them, they're still alive in your mind. And when the Lord is going to recall all of these people from the grave, it's partly because he knows them. He knows you. He remembers you. It's like we read in Ecclesiastes. I have to think now. This is Ecclesiastes, the 12th. I might even have it written down. 12:6, I think it is. When we have Ecclesiastes 12:7. Then shall the dust return unto the earth, and the spirit unto God who gave it. And one of the important things in my own mind, when I read that verse, that the spirit returns to God who gave it, is that our memories, in the modern world of science, they are convinced that your memories are in your brain, and that's where everything is stored. And now we have a computer analog where we understand how you can save things to the hard drive or to a flash drive or whatever. But I want you to know this, and you can look this up just as easily as anybody can find anything on the web now. Even though science still firmly believes that everything that you remember is in your brain, no trace of any kind of memory has ever been found in any organic being, even though billions of dollars have been spent over decades in an attempt to find it, because there's huge profits that are available to pharmaceutical companies, to biomedical companies, people doing Alzheimer's research. If they could make a pill to help you think better, to help you remember better, right? But it's failed for decades. After the smartest researchers have looked and spent all kinds of money, they found nothing, because maybe your memories are not all in your brain, right? And the spirit returns unto God who gave it. So, don't want to ramble, brother. All right, so here's an excerpt from life, death, hereafter. It's at the end of LDH. It's right before the appendix. When I was examining this, I wasn't really sure if all of this material was written by, well, I don't know who all of this material is written by. It seems to be a compendium. I think a lot of it was written by Brother Russell. But we talked about resurrection, and this is comment that I found. I'm pretty sure this is Brother Russell's comment. The moment of reawakening, talking about the resurrection, will seem to the awakened ones to be the next moment after their death. And he quotes, there is neither wisdom, knowledge, nor device in the grave. So then he continues saying that the bodies in which the world will be awakened will be practically the same as those which died, although not the same atoms of matter. For in the hands of a creator, one atom is as good as another in this great work. Thus, St. Paul says, thou sowest not that body which shall be. And he continues saying that the bodies of the world, when they shall be awakened, will be really new bodies in the sense that they will be different atoms of matter, but they will be old bodies in the sense that they will be duplicates of those which died and went to dust. So this reminds us of sayings of our Lord concerning, if your eye offends you, this is Matthew 18:8. Wherefore, if thy hand or foot offend thee, cut them off and cast them from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life halt or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire, not destruction, right? And if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. So when you enter into life halt or maimed, that means that your flawed physical body that you died with is coming back the same way. It's going to have the same physical flaws. And that's how you enter into life halt or maimed, in the words of Jesus. So this is a thing that I guess people don't all believe. One of the things that Brother Johnson writes, I had copied this because I didn't want to get it wrong. Brother Johnson writes that the this is in the 17th Epiphany volume, and this begins around, it's a long ramble that begins around page 120, 121. It's 4 or 5 pages, and he explains that the first of those to be resurrected, earthly resurrection, would be the ancient worthies, and that we expect them to be appearing out of Jerusalem. They will be manifest to the world in that they will have some certain qualities that we don't really know about that will manifest themselves. Maybe they're brilliant leaders or something. I don't really know. That's a speculation on my part, but we do understand, Brother Johnson says, that they will be in possession of perfect human bodies. They will not be perfect in their character development yet, but this is the better resurrection mentioned in Hebrews 11th chapter. That's the better resurrection that they get, is that they come out of the grave with a perfect human body. So that's first. Then he continues to say that this is the method by which the resurrection happens. He says, and this is Brother Johnson, I think maybe some speculation here, certainly, because we don't know. He says that the non-elect dead, those are the dead who would be excluded from that first round of resurrection, will be coming back in companies and at various intervals. And that, you know, those who had been brought back already would be waiting to assist the new ones up the highway of holiness, because things will be different than they are now. Things will be a little easier for people to make progress in learning to live righteously. And then also, you know, the fact that you didn't have a perfect body when you came back, that's another incentive to develop, because you think, oh, I can, you know, have all of my physical ailments taken care of, and I can get a body that's perfect. So that is going to be a thing that happens over, you know, all the way up to the end of the millennial age, I guess, almost. Don't know. So when I started to speak, I mentioned Brother Weinar and how he said, when I'm done with my presentation, I'm going to tell you when the resurrection begins. And this is what he said to us. Soon. Soon. So hope you're not disappointed, brethren. Didn't think I was going to give you a date, I hope. But soon, I hope it will be. So may the Lord add his blessing